Okay, it's 7:30 and we're going to get started. Welcome to the October meeting of the Johnson Space Center Astronomical Society. I'm Doug Holland, the president of the JSCAS, and here's our agenda for this evening. If you have a question or comment that you would like to provide to one of our presenters, you can either enter it as a YouTube comment if you have an account that will let you do that, or you can send your question or comment to the JSCAS Live at gmail.com as shown at the bottom of the slide. And Trevor Quinn will be taking those questions and comments and providing them to each one of our presenters when he receives them. Okay, so for our agenda today, we have Journey Through Space and Time on the Road to the Milky Way with Jay and Neil Shet. Following that, we will have a DIY astronomy from David Haviland on astronomical and other considerations in 3D printing. Then we'll be followed by another DIY astronomy that I will be doing on a DIY radio telescope, 21 centimeter hydrogen measurements of the Milky Way. Then we'll have a member's minute from Chris Wells, Home and Away Astrophotos, and we'll wrap it up then with Star Party News with David Haviland. So first, our main talk for tonight, Journey Through Space and Time on the Road to the Milky Way with Jay and Neil Shet. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Jay and Neil. Jay and Neil Shet are homeschool high school students who live in Sugar Land, Texas. Jay is 17 years old and Neil is 14. They started photography in 2011 and have since traveled to all the lower 48 states in the US. They were inspired to do astrophotography after joining the Fort Bend Astronomy Club, FBAC, in 2018. They also have a passion for building homemade telescopes out of everyday items. In 2018, they made a refractor telescope out of a Tootsie Roll canister, and shortly after made a reflector telescope out of a salt container. They have volunteered in Astronomy on Wheels AOW events organized by the Fort Bend Astronomy Club that goes to elementary and middle schools to spread the awareness of astronomy. In these AOW events, Jay and Neil have shared their passion for astronomy in presentations and have inspired kids as well as their parents to build homemade telescopes out of materials found at home. They are members of the Houston Camera Club, in which they have done presentations and conducted photography workshops. They have also done 2 presentations in the Fort Bend Astronomy Club, the Photon Club in Cullinan Park, and have been invited to present online at the Astronomical Society of Eastern Missouri, ASEM. Jay and Neil also enjoy collecting rocks and minerals and were members of the Houston Gem and Mineral Society, HGMS. In 2018 and 2019, Neil placed first in the annual HGMS Youth Cabochon contest. Jay and Neil have won numerous awards for their photography. Neil won first place in the 2020 Photography Society of America PSA Youth Showcase, People/Animals category. Jay and Neil have won second and third place respectively in the youth category of the International Dark Sky Association 2020 Capture the Dark Photo Contest. Jay won the Astronomical League's 2020 Horkheimer/Diaria Youth Service Award, as well as the 2020 Horkheimer/Parker Youth Imaging Award. Jay and Neil have won many awards from the Houston Camera Club monthly and yearly photo contests. So far, Jay and Neil have published 2 articles about their adventures in the Astronomical League's Reflector magazine. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jay and Neil Shet.
Jay and Neil, you have a go.
Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm going to start out dramatic. We're going to take you on a journey through space and time on the road to Milky Way. This presentation is going to be about 2 of our biggest projects in astrophotography so far. One is the 200 image mosaic we made of the entire Milky Way galaxy. And then after that, we're going to talk about a little something we call the phase-stacked moon. And the phase-stacked moon is based on the notion that on a full moon, you can't really see all of the craters. It looks 2-dimensional. And astronomers recommend observing lunar craters during other phases, such as a half moon and a gibbous moon. So since the full moon doesn't exhibit all the craters, we decided to take all the different phases of the moon and combine them together into a composite full moon image in which all the craters are visible. So we cut out all the different craters of each phase and combine them in Photoshop. And we'll talk about that after our Milky Way. So our journey began in 2011. I was 7 years old and my brother was 5. And since then we have traveled to all the lower 48 states in the US. We enjoy different types of photography, from landscapes to wildlife, macro, and of course, astrophotography. And we have won numerous awards for our work. So here are some images from our recent travels. And I'm just going to share with you some of the pictures we've taken while traveling across the US. So this is going to be our landscape photography. Maine. And this one's from Utah. And we are passionate about wildlife photography as well. We took this picture just last week, and the hummingbirds are migrating south in this season, so we're taking full advantage of it. And another thing we do is macro photography. So this is a close-up photo of a wasp, and it looks really menacing. So our interest in astronomy began 2 years ago. And it all started with this. This is a telescope that we made out of a Tootsie Roll canister. The objective lens is about 3 inches wide. And shortly after that, we made a reflector telescope out of a salt canister. And together we call this the sweet and salty duo. And we've also built 2 more refractor telescopes out of toilet roll tubes. And we even gave the reflector telescope a tripod and a mount because it's kind of difficult to handhold a reflector telescope. That's why it was necessary to build the tripod. And this tripod you see here is actually from a small camera tripod, which we had for many years. So we decided to use it. And after joining the Fort Bend Astronomy Club 2 years ago, we were inspired to take up deep astrophotography. And with that, we started deep sky imaging. We decided to use whatever we had instead of buying more equipment. So this is what we had for a long time, the Canon EOS R. And we had originally used a cheap tracking mount that came with a $100 telescope, but since then we've upgraded to this one, which is much better. And a guide camera and a guide scope were necessary for longer exposures because the tracking mount alone couldn't handle the tracking very well without the guide camera and guide scope. And as for getting a telescope, we didn't have to. We had a bunch of lenses, which were pretty good in quality. And the 150 to 600 millimeter lens is what we normally use for deep sky imaging. The 135 millimeter we used for our 200 image Milky Way panorama, which I'm going to talk about soon. And the Canon 24 to 70, along with the 14 millimeter Sigma, which is not in this list. We use those 2 lenses for landscape imaging and the Milky Way. So this is one of our first attempts at deep sky imaging. This picture was taken from Arches National Park in Utah. And the reason we travel to places is to do astrophotography because our backyard is not so good for it. there are way too many trees, and the northern celestial pole, that's where Polaris is blocked by trees, so we can't really do polar alignment. And so we have to do deep sky imaging in dark places that we travel to. Here's another picture, this time the Horsehead Nebula, the Pleiades. We took this picture from in California. And this one was taken from Big Bend National Park, which is right here in Texas. Here we have the Orion Constellation. So we have thoroughly enjoyed doing deep sky imaging, but we didn't have the best equipment. We were still using DSLRs, and we don't have a telescope yet. Instead of spending a lot more money doing deep sky imaging, we decided to do something else because there was no way to get better at this without purchasing more equipment. And because we had these camera lenses, we decided to focus on our strengths instead. One was years of experience in photography. Second was traveling. And because we did these two things, we had access to dark sky places in the country. And so these three make the perfect formula for taking pictures of the Milky Way, which we cannot do where we live in Houston. So here's our very first picture of the Milky Way, which we took in Tucson last February in 2019. So this was a pretty good image back then when we were starting out. We were pretty excited with this, but as you can see, there's the glow from the sunrise, and that's because February is too early to take pictures of the Milky Way because it rises just after the sun rises. So we end up getting this glow near the horizon. And a better time would have been to take during the summer, which we did eventually. And we've got better pictures. So this is a 30-second exposure, f2.8 and ISO 3200. Yeah, and another lens we use is the 16 to 35 millimeter f2.8. It's a pretty good lens for taking pictures of the Milky Way. Now, if we had taken a closer look, obviously there are star trails. So we generally follow the rule of 500, which is a guideline to help us decide what exposure length to use. And so it goes this: 500 divided by the focal length of the lens. So if we were to use a 16 millimeter lens, that would be equivalent to a 31-second exposure without getting star trails that are too noticeable because the Earth rotates. And if we were to use the 24 millimeter, we'd be down to 20 seconds. And we even took self-portraits with the galaxy. And this one was particularly challenging because that's me in the picture, and I had to stand there for 30 whole seconds holding my hands up in the air. So that was pretty tiresome. And this isn't the first shot. This was the third or fourth attempt at it because the foreground's pretty dark, and we wanted the camera to be so low on the ground so that I would stick up above the horizon and see a silhouette of myself. Otherwise, I'd just be obscured by the shadows below. And here's another picture of me posing with the Milky Way, and I'm pretending to be carrying the galaxy in my hands. And then, because the foregrounds were dark in our previous attempts, we decided to do light painting, which we learned shortly after, and we've got better pictures. And that's me and Neil sitting at Big Bend National Park admiring the galaxy. Now this one is light painting as well as a panorama composed of 3 images, each 30 seconds, and these settings in the lower right. And we call this one Front Seat at the Milky Way Theater, and I won 3rd place in the International Dark Sky Association's photo contest youth category with this image. And another one of our favorite places to visit is Arches National Park. And during the day, we take landscapes such as these. And at night, we do Milky Way photography. So one technique that we've been utilizing just lately is creating high dynamic range images. So what that means is on the right we have a Milky Way and the foreground, but it's too dark. And on the left we have the foreground bright enough, but the Milky Way is star trailed, as we had used a 60-second exposure, and it's overexposed. So what we want to do here is blend the right image's sky with the left image's foreground, and that technique is known as exposure blending, otherwise known as high dynamic range, which is what HDR stands for. And we used Photoshop to do this, but it couldn't be done automatically, because when we tried merge to HDR in Photoshop, which is an automatic tool for blending exposures, it's just a big mess. Photoshop decided not to do anything, and it just ruined the whole image. There's another tool in Photoshop, in Adobe Camera Raw, and that does HDR too, but as you can see, it did a similar job to HDR Pro, and it's not very good. So this means we can't do these exposure blends automatically, but we have to do them manually. And by doing that manually, we ended up with the picture like this, which is properly exposed in the sky as well as the foreground. And after a little more editing, this is what we ended up with. We call this Road to Milky Way, and my brother won second place for this picture in the same contest. Now, I can't really open Photoshop right now, because it'll freeze the computer if I'm live streaming at the same time. So what I've done is I've taken screenshots of all the different steps that we took to manually blend in these two exposures, which are there in the layers panel. Taking a closer look at the layers panel, we have our two images as layers in Photoshop. And this is the layer mask icon. So I start by clicking on that. It creates a black layer mask. If you had Alt click on the layer mask, it makes a black one. And simply clicking on it without holding Alt makes a white layer mask. So what a black layer mask does is it temporarily conceals this top layer, layer 1, and reveals the image below, as you can see on the left. So now what I want to do is paint in this area of the sky. So what I do is first make a selection of that sky using select, color range, and these are just screenshots. I'm just pretending I'm in Photoshop. And then once I'm in color range, clicking on the drop-down menu, I select highlights. That selects all the bright parts of the image. And what I want to do here is make the sky completely white and make the foreground, the road and the rocks, black. To do that, I adjust these sliders as necessary. And now the sky is completely white. And don't worry about these lines here. These can be fixed later. The foreground is as dark as can be by adjusting these sliders. Once I hit OK, we simply have to use the paintbrush tool, which is right over here. And if I had hovered over that, we would get this pop-up. So selecting this paintbrush tool, and now we want to paint with white. Currently, I have black selected. So we can click on this tiny double arrow over here and switch the colors around. So now I'm going to paint with white. White reveals the underlying image or the image that is on top, and black conceals. So here's a short video clip of me blending the exposure together using the paintbrush tool. So with the paintbrush tool selected, I simply paint it in, And notice that because we made a selection, it's not going to overflow onto the rocks or the road. And that's very important. And now, to clean things up, we have to make this area and this area completely white. And to get this sort of preview, all we need to do is alt-click on the layer mask icon to get this preview, and it shows the enlarged version of the layer mask. And as you can see, we have some white lines here, which can be later fixed using a black paintbrush and simply painting over that. And obviously, you'll need to deselect this and then paint over it. So here's another video clip of me doing that. So clicking on the layer mask and making those areas completely white. So then after that, I used a black paintbrush and painted over that area. So this is what we got. And now it's a very nice blend. So here's another clip. And the advantage to doing this technique is that now I can individually edit the elements of the image. So when I do a simple curves adjustment on the layer below, it's only going to affect what is in that layer, which is the foreground. The same thing applies for the background. I can edit the Milky Way without affecting the foreground. And that's why this technique is so useful. And so this is what we got after a few more edits. Here's another exposure blend using the same technique, and this structure is called the Balanced Rock, which is in Arches National Park. And as you can see, there's a ton of snow on the ground. We went there during winter time, which was in November last year. Here's another image. Now the rock on the right is the same balanced rock, but from a different perspective. And sometimes we like to break the rule of 500. Instead of following it, here we did a 300-second exposure, and that created star trails. And that was by design. It made this scene look very nice, which was taken at 70 millimeters. This was in Canyonlands National Park, which is right next to Arches. So we had access to this park as well. And another thing that we've been experimenting with was creating star trails. And this is not a continuous exposure, but a blend of 100 exposures at 30 seconds. And this was created using a software called StarStax. Now we're going to show you a compilation of our time-lapse videos that we've taken so far. So this is in Arches, and as you can see, there's so many planes flying around. This one is from New Zealand, and you can see the large and small Magellanic clouds. This one's also from New Zealand. And at Big Bend, there were hardly any planes in contrast to Arches, and that was really nice. That's why we like to go to Big Bend, because there are hardly any planes, but there are satellites, of course, but no planes flying around. But even after all this, we felt that there was something lacking in our images. One was resolution, and because resolution lacked, so did detail. And I mean detail in the Milky Way galaxy. So let's take a closer look at the center of the Milky Way. And of course it's star trailed, but there's not a whole lot of detail in this single exposure. which is what we were very disappointed with. And that meant because we used a short focal length, which was either 14 millimeters, 16 millimeters, or 24 millimeters, that meant we got less detail. And so we decided to use a longer focal length, such as using a telephoto lens, to get even more detailed. And when we did that, we were really impressed with the results. This was with the Sigma 135 millimeter lens at f1.8. But obviously, the Milky Way doesn't fit, the entire Milky Way doesn't fit in this whole frame. It's too narrow a field of view. So from here on, we decided to make a panorama of the entire galaxy using the Sigma 135 millimeter lens. And we knew it would be a large project and a very long one too. So here's an example of the sequence of images that we took to construct the panorama. And this is just 6 images. We still had a long way to go. And then after we took the galactic center, we imaged the other parts of the Milky Way that are visible in the northern hemisphere. And we blended them together in Photoshop. So it turned out to be 60 images of data, and it may not look like 60 images. That's because the images needed to overlap on each other so that Photoshop would be able to recognize where exactly to stitch them. And we acquired these pictures at Big Bend National Park. And while we were there, we saw many creatures of the night. As soon as we got down from the car to set up our equipment, we came across this tarantula. And it turns out it was there for the whole session. We were out there for about 2 or 3 hours, and by the time we were done, it was still there. And we didn't bother it, it didn't bother us, so all was good. And we took this picture using our cell phone and a flashlight. So another thing we saw was a rattlesnake on the road. It was our second time seeing a rattlesnake, so we were pretty happy we saw it. And another challenge with doing deep sky imaging at Big Bend at that time of year was that it was so cold that our hands were freezing. I mean, the gloves we had were good, but not good enough. It took only 20-30 minutes before our hands were super cold that they were so stiff we could hardly even press the button to take a picture. And that was one challenge. And we couldn't really go back into the car because these are 30-second exposures, and that's really short period of time. And we had to be there the whole time. And while we were there too, at Big Bend, we heard coyotes howling in the distance, and we managed to capture a coyote just before sunset at that park. And my brother calls this Coyote in the Spotlight, and he won first place for this image in the PSA Youth Showcase. So now I have a couple more screenshots, which will show you how we merged the panorama together. So first was to align the layers. So here I have only 4. And once they are aligned in this way, we blend them together by clicking Edit, Auto Blend Layers, and selecting Panorama, as well as Seamless Tones and Colors. And it's important not to do the last option, which is Content Aware Fill Transparent Areas. What that does is it fills in these transparent pixels with stars and whatever content is here, and that's not right. So you shouldn't select this if you're making mosaics. So once that was blended together, we were finished with 4 images, but it's only 4 images. And that took 20 minutes to process. The reason it took that long, well, our computers are really slow. We only have a 4 GB RAM and 2-core processor. So, and Photoshop recommends an 8 GB RAM. That's the minimum to even have a properly functioning computer with Photoshop. So that's why it took a really long time, and we couldn't blend all 60 images together at the same time because our computer would apparently crash. We had to take things one step at a time, and we decided to start with sets of 4 images and build up from there. So with that, we made sets of 4, and then next step was to group them into 8. And you can see that there's a lone 4 there. And then after that 16, and you get the idea. It goes on up from there, and we get the final output. This way actually worked. Photoshop never crashed during these steps. It only crashes when we try to blend all of this straight up there without these steps. So that was a pretty good solution to work up in groups. But as the files got larger and larger, they took more time to process. This whole set down here of 4 took 6 hours, and the next set took 8 hours, then 10, then 20, and the last one took more than 24 hours. So our computer was just sitting there idle, processing the final output while we were minding our own business. And as soon as it was done, we were pretty happy with the result. And if numbers aren't your thing, we can explain it to you visually. So the images are just raining down from the sky. There's the last one. Now, as a visual representation, hopefully the animation's smooth, we group them into 4s, just like this, and then groups of 8, like so. And from there, it's pretty straightforward. And the panorama had jagged edges, so we decided to crop that out. And this portion wasn't the entire Milky Way from the northern hemisphere. So we went back to Big Bend to take the rest of the northern hemisphere Milky Way, which was 60 more images. And we've also included Andromeda, which doesn't fit in this cropped image. It's somewhere down here or up there. I keep forgetting. And that took 40 more hours to process. So in total, this image you see here took us more than 100 hours to post-process in Photoshop. And it's a very large image, counting up to 339 megapixels. Now, all that was left to do was the southern hemisphere. We had started this project back in September, and we didn't go to the southern hemisphere until February. All those months, we were thinking we'd never go to the southern hemisphere. But luckily, our parents planned a trip to New Zealand, and we immediately jumped at that opportunity. So we spent 6 days and 6 nights. And this was the very first night. Apparently there were way too many clouds. We spent 2 hours trying to take pictures, but the clouds were just everywhere. We were slewing our mount back and forth, and the clouds just kept ruining the images, so we gave up. And this was taken from our campsite. And so day 2, we went to Mount Cook National Park, which is in South Island, New Zealand. And it's a very beautiful national park. We enjoyed the hike to Mount Cook. And it was a pretty long hike. The boardwalk here is the trail that leads to Mount Cook. But the night wasn't so prosperous. It was totally cloudy with rain showers forecast. So we decided not to do any imaging. And the third day was particularly exciting because we thought it would be clear. But apparently there were two things. One was fog. In this image you don't see fog because it was taken just before the fog came. But you can see fog on the right side as well as some on the left. The fog was moving from left to right. Um, and so we were pretty lucky to get at least this wide angle shot. And the van in the foreground is the RV that we had rented for the trip, and it gave us it allowed us to camp anywhere we wanted, so we could do astrophotography. If we had not done RV and instead stayed at hotels, we wouldn't have had the freedom to go anywhere we wanted. So, and plus the crescent moon is right on top of the galactic center, which was not good. And here's an image that we ended up with that night. And it might seem good, but actually it's not. Once we post-process this, we're gonna start seeing clouds. It might be too faint to see on the screen, but these are actually clouds and a ton of fog, which makes the stars bloated. The next day was even worse with fog and plenty of clouds in sight. And the large Magellanic Cloud and the small Magellanic Cloud are visible on the upper right of this image. We spent around 5 or 6 hours desperately trying to take the Milky Way, but the clouds were just everywhere, even on this night. We were getting more and more desperate as the days went by, and so we weren't able to thoroughly enjoy the trip because we were rushed. This is day 5, and we still hadn't taken any frames for the Milky Way panorama. And after this, we thought we should give up because we had only 1 day left, 6 days. And if we couldn't get the Milky Way panorama done, we would have left New Zealand empty-handed. But we were very lucky, extremely lucky, because the last campsite had totally clear skies, even though the forecast showed cloudy skies. So there's barely any clouds in sight. We started imaging at 9 o'clock because the entire Milky Way wasn't visible. Just this Carina Nebula and a little bit of the coal sack was visible. We still had to wait a very long time to see the galactic center. And we needed the galactic center so that we would be able to connect it with merge it with the northern part. And so we stayed up till 5 a.m., a solid 8 hours without sleeping. In fact, we hadn't slept the whole day. So for us, it was a 24-hour day, which is probably typical if you're in astronomy. You tend to spend a lot of time staying up at night. So we spent a lot of time, and everybody else was sleeping, even our parents. And there were several tempting deep sky objects that we just couldn't pass, like the small Magellanic Cloud. And our favorite one is the large Magellanic Cloud. We even did some deep sky of the Carina Nebula using the Sigma 135 and stacking 6 frames together. And this is a cropped version of the original image. So here's the panorama that we ended up with, and it was composed of 85 images. And as you can see, it was pretty wild. It's not a neat panorama. That's because we're not used to the southern hemisphere, so we were trying to get as much sky as possible. We couldn't afford to have any gaps within the panorama. Like we have gaps here and some over here. It was good that these gaps didn't reach all the way into this Milky Way, so we didn't overkill. We actually took more than 85 images, around 100 or 150 or so. so that we just don't miss anything. And this final output is composed of 85 images. And as you can see, we've managed to reach all the way to the Lagoon Nebula. And as I previously showed you, the Northern Hemisphere mosaic contains the Lagoon Nebula. So now we would be able to connect these two images together. And so to remove the jagged edges again, we cropped it. Now, comparing it with a single wide-angle shot, it really does make a difference. Let's take two cross sections of the galaxy and compare them side by side. The one on the right is the 14mm wide-angle shot, and as you can see, there's not a whole lot of detail compared to the panorama section. Like the cat's paw is very clearly visible here, and here it's hardly visible. So when we combine that with the Northern Hemisphere, it turns out to be 205 images. So it's 90,000 pixels wide and 6,900 pixels in height. And as for the statistics, the file size, each individual image produced by the Canon EOS R is 30 megabytes in size. The size of the uncropped, the jagged edges panorama is 3 gigabytes. The one you see here, the cropped version, is 1 gigabyte. As for the image dimensions, each individual image was 30 megapixels, and this one is 620, the cropped image. And that's a single image for reference. So the project lasted 6 months, starting in September, and we finished processing all of the images in Photoshop in March. So it took us over 200 hours of processing time. And as for the number of computer crashes, well, there were way too many to count. Now let's take a closer look at the galactic center. We call this one Downtown Milky Way, and I won first place for this in an astrophotography contest. Now, obviously, you can't appreciate all the details just by looking at this image. So in the next slide, we created a video that shows the Milky Way panorama up close from left to right. And we've circled all of the deep sky objects that we found interesting. So this section was taken during our second trip to Big Bend, up until the Elephant's Trunk Nebula. And then the first night started here and went all the way to the galactic center. So there are tons of deep sky objects in the constellation Cygnus, which was pretty exciting. And we managed to capture one thing, and that is a meteor. It happened to be in one of our frames, so we decided to include it into the final panorama. And from here on starts the data we captured from South Island, New Zealand. The Coalsack Nebula was one object that we could clearly see with the naked eye because it was silhouetted amongst all of these bright stars. So we were able to appreciate that when we went to the southern hemisphere. And so this is the whole panorama. So we really wanted to add more to the panorama. We had finished the southern and northern parts, but we could extend it up and down, not left and right, because we already did that. By going up and down, we give the Milky Way a little more breathing room. But since the pandemic began, we haven't been able to travel. And so since we live in Houston, and so because of light pollution, we can't do this anymore until we start traveling again. And so we thought about deep sky imaging, but we remembered that there are too many trees in our backyard. They block Polaris, so we cannot do polar alignment, which is the most important step for deep sky imaging. So that's out of the question. And we decided to take up planetary imaging. And luckily, we acquired a Celestron Schmidt-Cassegrain C8, which was actually donated to us for free by a fellow astronomer who is moving to another state. And this was an old model from the 1980s. So no wonder he wanted to get rid of it. But we've made really great use of this telescope. And now my brother Neil is going to talk about some of our planetary imaging as well as the phase-stacked moon project. Okay, so this is an image of Jupiter that we took with our C8 telescope that has a focal length of 2,000 millimeters. And over here, we have Ganymede, and it casts a shadow here because the sun is not always behind, like facing on Jupiter. So the light coming from the sun is at an angle. So that's why Ganymede is here and Ganymede's shadow is over here. And Io's shadow is here, and you may not see Io, and that's because it's over the surface of Jupiter and it blends in with the surface. So that's why I cannot see it. And on this same night, we took a 2-hour time lapse of Jupiter and compressed it into a GIF to capture the motion of the rotating planet. A 3-hour time lapse. And as you can see, Ganymede goes away from Jupiter, orbits around Jupiter, and its shadow enters the frame, and then Io goes over the surface of Jupiter, and its shadow just comes across the frame when Io is just above the surface. And here's our best picture of Saturn we took at opposition. And Venus, which is it's at a half phase right now. And recently we took Mars. So we enjoyed planetary imaging, but we thought that there wasn't really much to planetary imaging other than taking the planets themselves. So we thought about taking the moon. And after taking spending a few nights imaging the moon, we came up with a project called the phase stack moon, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm going to show you a few images that we took of the moon. And also we took a 3-image panorama of the moon here. And we noticed something, and that's that the sharpest and most prominent craters are along the terminator, which is what divides the shadow of the moon and the one that's visible. And as you can see, the craters are very visible, but over here, you can hardly see them. And here are 2 different phases that we took. This is a gibbous phase, and this is a crescent phase. And if you notice, this crater over here is the exact same crater as this one, but the crescent phase, the terminator is closer to the crater over here, but over here it's much further away. That's why it's hardly visible here, whereas here it's more visible. So we thought, what if we could see all the craters at once? Well, we could see the whole surface of the moon at once, but we can't really see any craters. They look more like smudges. For example, Copernicus. On a different phase where the terminator is closer to Copernicus, it really stands out. So what we did was we cut out craters from each phase and blended them together, the sharpest parts of each phase, and blended them together to make a composite full moon. So we had to pick which phases to image. There were the waxing phases. They were convenient because they appeared in the evening sky, but because there are way too many trees in our backyard, we couldn't really see the western sky, so that meant we wouldn't be able to see the crescent phases. We could only see from the eastern sky up to the zenith, so that was out of the question. There were the waning phases. We could image all of them because they appeared in the morning sky, but they were inconvenient because they appeared in the morning sky. So we would have to get up in the middle of the night for more than a week to image all of them. So here are the 12 waning phases that we took in 12 days. And we had to get up at different times for each phase because we had like about 2 to 3 hours gap where we could see the moon. So if we get up any later than for example, for this 90% phase, we had to get up at 11:30, and any later than that, the moon would have been behind the trees. And as for the about here in the middle, we had to get up at 2:30, and the last phase we got up at 6 a.m. So here are the 12 phases and their percentages. And we combined them in Photoshop and blended the sharpest craters of each phase. And we called this the phase stacked moon. And here it is. So you can see almost every crater, and when you compare it to a regular full moon image, you cannot really see any craters except for the bigger, most prominent ones like this one. And when you zoom in, it really does make a difference. So this is the waning phase stacked moon that we took in summer of this year. And we had actually done this before the pandemic started back in January of this year. And it wasn't really that great because we didn't have a telescope at that time. So we had to use a 600 millimeter lens, and that's why the resolution is not that great. And also, our data wasn't that great, so that's why the moon doesn't look that good. So here are the specifications of the project. We took a total of 12 phases, 37 videos, and the reason we took videos was because it was better to stack thousands of frames from the videos in a software called Registax to counter the blur of the atmosphere from the Earth. And instead of taking single images, that would take a really long time. A video would capture like hundreds of frames per second, so that was more efficient. And the total size of the videos was more than 150 gigabytes. And we took Ultra HD 4K videos at 30 frames per second. And we stacked a total of 25,000 images out of the 75,000 images we took, so about 33%. And we took more than 46 hours to process all the data, so 20 hours to stack all the images and make the panorama, and 20 more hours to stitch them and make the composite in Photoshop. And this whole project lasted a month. So now Jay is going to talk about how we made the phase stacked moon. So there were two big steps that we had to do, and those two were, one, the moon wobbles in its orbit. So we had to manually align the individual craters, and the more formal definition for this is libration. And then the second, which was the toughest step, was making it seamless. And after we aligned the individual craters, the composite looked quite ugly. So we needed to make the composite seamless by brightening and darkening specific areas of the moon so that it looks natural. And here's an example of libration. The 20% illuminated phase, take a look at this detail here, the mare. And on the right, the mare is much further away because of libration. The moon tends to oscillate in such a way that some areas tend to be facing away in different phases. So that was a problem when it came to aligning the craters. And so we did that in Photoshop. Here's a short clip of me doing that. So taking two phases and reducing the transparency opacity of one of the phases so that I can see where I'm aligning. I use a technique called puppet warping, which basically just stretches the image. And that allows me to align craters individually without moving other parts of the image. So hopefully this is not too fast, but what I'm basically doing is I'm stretching the images in ways so that the craters align. Like taking that crater and just aligning that, so that crater too. Here's another clip. So I take first that crater, move it around, and then I have a couple of craters on the lower left that need aligning. So when I align that, it doesn't affect any of this area. So other features of the moon that I aligned by creating points and simply dragging, like that crater as well. Create a point, drag it, and that's basically how we countered the libration of the moon. And then the toughest part was blending the phases together. And you won't believe what it looked like as the first draft. Right after aligning all the craters, this is what it looked like. Pretty weird. It doesn't look natural. So this took us so much time. In fact, it took us 18 to 20 hours to do all of this work in Photoshop. There was a lot of cleaning up to do. So doing a few edits, actually a lot of edits, we tried to neutralize the moon so that it looked seamless, countering all of the shadow area. And then later on, we fixed these smaller details using the brush tool and brightening and darkening tools. As you can see, there are lots of smudges here and there. And to fix those, we used the dodge and burn tool. The dodge tool brightens areas, and the burn tool, which I'm using here, darkens them. And so we're trying to bring back detail in this mare by darkening the area. So that corrects for the exposure. And then I'm further darken down the other areas, and that took a lot of time. And so after all of that, we ended up with this. And there's still some improvements that need to be done to this image. Sometimes we see a thing or two that we need to fix, and we go into Photoshop to fix it. But this is the best we have come up with. The phase stacked moon, you can see all of the craters. It's a full moon, but all the craters are visible, which is why we like it. It allows one to appreciate every single crater at once. So yes, this is what we have done so far in astrophotography. Just 2 years into this field, and we have done so much that we hope to continue doing more. So thank you very much, and hopefully there are some questions that I can answer.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. When you were doing the homemade telescopes, what lenses and mirrors were you
Okay, the
using?
lens was from a magnifying glass, a simple, cheap magnifying glass that we had at home. The eyepiece is also magnifying glass. As for the reflector, it's a small shaving mirror that was concave. And plus, we bought a tiny flat mirror as the secondary.
Okay, another question came in, but I think you guys covered it pretty well with your presentation. But how did you stitch the Milky Way images together in Photoshop?
Well, there were just two steps. One was to auto-align the layers, which we simply do by going to Edit, Auto-Align Layers, and then after that, Photoshop just stitches them. Then we simply blend them together. So that makes it seamless and gets rid of the edges. Just those two steps, and that's it. And if you look up online, there are tons of tutorials for stitching panoramas and mosaics, and it's pretty simple to do in Photoshop. But it took us a long time because we had to do it in groups of 4 and then build up from there.
What camera were you using again?
We used the Canon EOS R, which is a mirrorless camera.
And on your Milky Way, can you tell us about the tracking and general exposure settings you were using?
We used the Orion Series Pro tracking mount. And as for the general exposure settings, it was with a Sigma 135 millimeter lens. And each exposure was at 30 seconds. And we didn't really need a guide scope for that. Our tracking mount handled it pretty well. 30-second exposures, and then the aperture was set to f1.8 and the ISO to 3200, and that's about it as far as camera settings go.
Another question: when you were doing your panorama for the Milky Way, how were you deciding the angles to capture each individual frame with?
That's the reason we spent 2 to 3 hours out there. If you take into account all of the 30-second exposures, say the first night we went to Big Bend, we took 60 images and just 60 to 70 images, but decided to stitch 60 images. So that means it's a 30 minutes of data. 30 seconds times 60 is 30 minutes. And so we spent the majority of our time slewing the mount, and it was pretty tricky. The galactic center was quite easy because it was very bright, and so it was easier to navigate. But once we got to the outskirts, as we call it, the dust lanes and nebulae started getting more scarce, and so we gave each image a 50% overlap and spent a lot of time figuring out the angles, and we did it pretty well. We managed to do it pretty well.
With all these interests you guys have done, what do you see you guys doing for your careers?
Well, I'm 17 and my brother's 15. Currently, I'm undecided, and I plan on taking a gap year to travel extensively across the US and hopefully cover those last 2 states, Alaska and Hawaii. And so hopefully we can do this soon enough. And we also want to improve our photography skills. We're just getting started here. We had actually started in 2011, but we were very young at that time, and for many years we stopped, and then we started again 3 years ago. And since then, we've improved tremendously, and we continue improving, and we hope to continue participating in photo contests and giving talks in the future maybe. And so yeah, I'm currently undecided, but hopefully I can find something to do.
One last question that I can think of is, have you guys thought about trying any kind of automation to do the angles on your panoramas?
But when we started the project, we were quite inexperienced with deep sky imaging, and that meant inexperience in using the tracking mount. And so we haven't yet gotten to the point of using automated software. And so we do hope on using it. Maybe it would have helped because it makes slewing a whole lot easier. So that's something that we can think about when we want to add more images to the panorama. And I mean by going up and down to give this Milky Way a bit more breathing space, because it seems kind of cramped in this cropped image.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and swing back over to Doug. Doug, you have.
All right, thank you. Jay and Neil, thank you for that very interesting talk. And that's a lot of good work. Thank you for sharing that with us. Very interesting, and we'll be looking forward to seeing what you guys do next. All right, next up, we have David Haviland with a DIY Astronomy, Astronomical, and other considerations in 3D printing. Take it away, David.
All right. This has been kind of a work in progress. So it's definitely not done. But I want to chat a little bit about, as I said, astronomical and other considerations in 3D printing. So back in March, I picked up an Ender 3D Pro printer. This is actually one of the more inexpensive, high quality, high throughput 3D printers out there. And there are a number of printers out there, but this is modestly priced. It's just a bit over $220, $230. I had to make room for it, so I had to do some serious fall cleaning, and we got it set up, and we've been playing with it ever since. And this is basically what the critter looks like. Got to give them a decent footprint. I didn't fully realize it at the time, but 3D printing is basically a hobby in of itself. Like a scope, the printer's got to be aligned. It's got to work just so. There's got to be just the spacing between the bed and the extrusion nozzle has to be just right. Or you can end up with a complete extruded wad of spaghetti that's basically going straight to trash. Now, the filament isn't outrageously priced, but it's not something you want to have. You don't want to have this happen very often. Now, common to 3D printers are what are called STL files, or the common files that are the design of whatever object you're interested in. And you have to take them through what's called a slicing program, such as one called Cura. And the slicer knows and has the settings specific for your printer, and it generates what's called a Q code file that you use for printing. Now, if I generate a Q code for a given object for my printer, I couldn't give this Q code to Doug if he has a different printer. The printer will come out with something complete, will come up with a substandard object. And that's basically what's happened here on some early tests of some objects that I've done. You're going to actually see this, and you'll find out what this is later. You're going to actually see the awful ribbing in here, and you can almost see through this 2 centimeter cube square that's actually used as a acid test, if you will, to test the quality of the printer. Here is when it's properly matched. These I can smash with my thumb and index finger. This one I would have to take a hammer to. Now, when you get that worked out, then you can get around and start actually having some fun. And there's a dreadful website called Thingiverse, and you can just get lost. It's like being a kid in a candy store. You can go, ooh, that's nice. Ooh, that's nice. And put a lot of things into your folders that you might want to consider printing. Well, one of the first things I printed was this fellow. Might talk about him later on in a future talk. This is something you would use to align your laser alignment. Now, is aptly quoted by Don Halter at one club meeting, you have to make sure the collimator is collimated, or this thing will completely gack up any telescope you try to use it with. And that is basically what this device is for, to help you collimate this. And it was a small little thing that took maybe 2 hours to print. There are other things that I was interested in. One, on the back of my C11, you'll see a Crayford here, and you're going to see this clothespin. Now, this clothespin gives you the feather touch, if you will. By touching back here and rotating this, I can avoid jarring the OTA and the entire scope when I need to make a slight adjustment in focus. But the more you look at this, the more you should see a problem. This clothespin is stretched so far that its only point of contact is back here at the rear end. The spring is fully stretched. And when it's dark, or as Jay and Neil said, trying to shoot the back half of the moon in the middle of the morning, you're reaching back here in the dark, and if you catch this wrong, I can't tell you how many clothespins have gone kaboing on me, and parts end up on the pool, and the other parts end up on the lawn behind you. So a couple of things we came up with were these fellows, to grab onto the fine focus adjustment and stay there, and they won't go flying across the backyard. This one on this one, and this one over here on the C11, it was cute, kind of had 4 knobs, and yeah, I did have to cut off this handle so that it would clear the back of the base plate here. So these have come out fairly handy with some things. This is kind of hot off the press. This is what it obviously is. It's a dew cover for a Telrad. It is very rigid, very solid, and actually kind of has to be snapped into place. It's not something that's easily removed. It took about 6 hours to print, but the problem is with a very bright object, I don't know about the rest of you, planets, moon, if I'm doing that at a star party, I tend to look down at the top. Well, that's okay. That still works. But this is in genuine a dew shield when you're out in the field, and you want to at least keep the dew off this plate here, because if you, as many of you know that have Telrads, once you get dew on this thing, it's kind of a nightmare. But there are also things there in 3D printing that makes you think twice. As I said, remember that part about being a kid in the candy store. I came across this and went, ooh, Copernicus. Yeah, I'm all in. Great, I love it. I've shot Copernicus. This is my shot here, and I think that high ridge is probably up here on the northeast side. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how the center spur peaks are in this model. Then you take the STL file and you take it through the slicing program, and the slicing program hands you a large slice of humble pie. It's going to take 300 grams of filament, or 105, basically 105 meters of filament. Filament is sold in 1 kilogram spools, and they're about $20. So it looks like I'm going to be spending about $7 on this, using a third of my spool, 1 day, 10 hours, 58 minutes, 24, 34, 35, machine dead time, and a few other things. That's 36 hours of printing. Past the novelty of having this thing printed, what are you going to use it for? It's going to collect dust, get kicked around. I said, I might hang on to the STL file, but I'm no longer in a hurry to print this thing, even though it was kind of initially cool to think about. Thought about doing Batnoff mask. You know, the only catch is the C8, the platter on the printer is just a hair bit over 8 inches long. So yet I'd need to download, and learn another software package to split this up. This is one thing you just can't print 4 of one side, because if you've ever worked with a Batnoff mask, 2 sides are the same, but the other 2 sides are different. And if you don't have them all matched up correctly, it's not going to function well. So, as I said, I'd have to separate it. 4 hours for each piece, 15 meters of filament. Started putting a lot of time into how to break it up, if I didn't say, and started weighing the value of time. So I also weighed just getting the mask off Amazon for $29. It arrived last Sunday. I elected not to do that. Also came across designs for Duncan collimation mask. Well, I'd already been there and done that with pizza tops, pizza box covers. They're very easy to do with a razor blade and a compass. But don't let that fool you. There are lots of other nifty things. I could be seeing a use for something like this into a small footprint to get a Telrad going. There are a number of Vixen bars. Now, I wouldn't mount a scope on there, but you could mount a small spotting scope. This is an impromptu mount for a Telrad on rings of a scope. You can fashion it to go this way. And this little guy could be handy without having to add a separate piece to your telescope. This is obviously for solar viewing. So when you're getting the sunlight coming through here, rather than, of course, looking through the scope, you can get it when the sun comes through here. Your scope is lined up and you can do some solar viewing. So lots of things you can work with and play with and do with a 3D printer. So as I said, Thingiverse here is just a way to get started, and I found this one. I want to throw it up for Doug. This is in fact a 3D printed barn door camera. Now I don't know how much of the motor assembly and the gears can be done, but I think the basic motor, drive, and the shaft will still have to be store-bought. But the bulk of this barn door tracker was 3D printed. And for those who really like the load-up scopes, these are easily printed as well. You may need to tinker with an object, modify it. A free program called Tinkercad. There's Fusion 360 and another program called FreeCAD. I don't know any of them. As I said, I've only been at this a few weeks. Programs to split the object up and go from there if needed. That's kind of where things are. I'd be happy to take any questions, but that's pretty much it for this one. Back to you, Doug. Yeah.
Hey, David. How did you decide on the 3D printer that you purchased?
A little bit of talking to John. I'd seen the reviews on it, and another gentleman, Dennis Gregassi over at FBAC, has 3 of them. He is an avid train hobbyist. He has an entire room with one of these people with the entire village and 4 or 5 trains running at once, in addition to being an astronomer. And he's either for his grandkids' astronomy or for his train, he's running 3 printers simultaneously. So the particular model came reasonably well recommended. And John included me in one day that Amazon had it at a pretty, just barely below a $200 price, and I just jumped on it.
All right. Thank you. Doug, you have a go.
All right, David, that was very interesting. That is really cool. That is really great. That is so much better than having to have everything made in a machine shop. So that's going to be, I think that's going to be the wave of the future in astronomy gadgets. So that's pretty cool that you are being the trailblazer on that. That's pretty exciting. Okay, so next up, I have a DIY astronomy, DIY radio telescope, 21 centimeter hydrogen measurements of the Milky Way. So I've been wanting to do radio astronomy for a long time, and I finally got around to doing a radio astronomy project. This is the first one I've done. I've been thinking about doing this for a very long time. This particular one is a radio telescope that is tuned to detect 21 centimeter, which is the same thing as 1.42 gigahertz, and that's a hydrogen emission line in the radio frequencies. So there's 3 main components to this contraption. There's a Wi-Fi dish antenna, which costs about $83. I got that on eBay, the source of all good things, of course. It has a 24 dB gain. If you're not familiar with antenna gain, that means how directional is this antenna versus a omnidirectional antenna. It tells you kind of the pattern that the antenna makes, whether it's only picking up from one direction or not. This is actually made for Wi-Fi at 2.4 gigahertz, but it works well also at 1.42 gigahertz. The beam width on this antenna is 14 degrees by 10 degrees. So, when we're taking pictures with a camera, we're thinking about resolution down in the arc seconds. Well, in the radio astronomy world, at least in this size of a dish, the resolution is pretty bad. It's like 14 degrees by 10 degrees for this antenna. So if you want to get better resolution, you have to have a huge dish or multiple dishes combined together as an interferometer. The next part of this configuration is the low noise amplifier, $45 from Amazon. This one gives you 40 dB of gain, and this is the low noise amplifier right down here. Right after it, this cable comes with the antenna, and then there's this low noise amplifier right here. That gives me 40 dB of gain, but that low noise amplifier also is tuned specifically for 21 centimeters, so it's made for measuring hydrogen. And the last part is the software-defined radio, which is down here, about $25, and that can be had at this web page, www.rtl.sdr.com. And it has a USB interface that allows you to hook it to your computer. Then the software to do all this is free. It's SDR Sharp software, which is free, and you'll see that here in just a minute. But the bottom line of this is the main components for this contraption is somewhere around $150. So somewhere around $150 for the main components, you can put together a 21 centimeter radio telescope. So I said a minute ago, the software-defined radio, SDR, interfaces to the computer by a USB cable. The SDR Sharp software controls the software-defined radio, and luckily this particular one, it has within its frequency range of 1.42 gigahertz. So you get this SDR Sharp software, but you also get another thing called IF average plugin, which is intermediate frequency average plugin. And what that's going to do is the IF average plugin is going to be used to average multiple samples together, decrease the noise and increase the signal. Just like in astrophotography, when we combine lots of images together to drive the noise down and make our signal come up, same thing for this. We are going to combine lots and lots of these samples, and they are going to do exactly the same thing. In fact, in this case, I believe that the number of samples that are being averaged together is on the order of 900,000 that I'm actually averaging together. Okay, so here's a close-up of the low noise amplifier here. And if you've got really good eyesight, you can see it says H1 right there, which means this is tuned for hydrogen. And the software-defined radio, you can find us at rtl-sdr.com. And you want to use very short connections on these because at these gigahertz frequencies, you don't want to have a bunch of long cables hanging out here. So the shorter the connections are, the better off you're going to be. Here's another view. This is the dish antenna. So I had to have some way to mount this. I used a shovel handle, an old shovel handle, to mount the dish antenna. When you buy the dish antenna, it comes with a clamp here on the back, and it just happens to be just the right size for a shovel handle. And I'd had a shovel handle in my garage for a long time. Shovel broke off. Stuck this in the garage, and I thought one of these days I'll use that for something. I didn't think I'd be making a radio telescope out of it, but what do you know? You can do that. And we have lots of trees in our backyard, so I do lots of lumberjacking, cutting down trees. A lot of times for astronomy projects, I can see the sky. But this is a counterweight that is made out of a part of a tree. I just took this and drilled a 1 1/4 inch hole in here and made a counterweight out of it. This whole thing is mounted on my Los Mandi tripod, so I took some other pieces of wood and made a Los Mandi tripod interface, we'll call it. Then back here, there's a threaded rod that you can use to move the antenna up and down to make it look at different altitudes. So what I did is I had this thing pointing directly south, and then I'm just using it I can change the altitude, and as the Earth turns, I'm going to let things come in and out of view of the antenna. I'm not using the antenna to track anything in particular at this point, but in this configuration, I'm letting the Earth turning and my altitude adjustment to help me find the different targets that I want to look at. Okay, so the first project I did with this, in fact, I just got this working this week, is I wanted to measure the rotation of the Milky Way galaxy. So if you're looking at the Milky Way, the part of the Milky Way that's going away from you is red shifted, and the part of the Milky Way that's going towards you is blue shifted. So in theory, if I have this hydrogen moving here, and it's supposed to be at normally 21 centimeters, as I look at the part of the sky where the Milky Way is moving away from me, I should be able to see a shift in the frequency towards the red And when I look at the part of the sky where the Milky Way is coming towards me, I should be able to see a blue shift. And I'm going to try this one here. Okay, so this is a video that shows the results. Okay, so on the right-hand side, this is stellarium. And the radio telescope is set about 15 degrees off the zenith. So here's zenith, so about 15 degrees, and here's south down here. 15 degrees south of zenith is probably about right in here where the antenna is pointing. Now, of course, it's 14 degrees by 10 degrees, so it's a pretty big circle that this antenna is actually picking up. Not very high resolution. But when I put this in motion, what's going to happen, this is going to be a 24-hour day where you're going to see the Milky Way move across what the antenna is pointing. And over here on this plot, you're going to be able to see the hydrogen. Here's 1420 megahertz again. When the Milky Way is coming toward, or sorry, moving away from us, it'll be redshifted. So you'll see frequencies down in here that are shifted towards lower frequencies, longer wavelengths. And then when the Milky Way is coming towards us, you'll see it blue shifted over here. You'll see the higher frequencies in shorter wavelengths, blue shifted as the Milky Way is coming towards us. I hope I didn't mix that up. Going away from us is red shifted, lower frequencies. Coming towards us is blue shifted, higher frequencies and shorter wavelengths. Okay, so let me put this in motion and hopefully this will all work. So there's the red shift. Well, and then you keep watching over here and you'll see one coming towards the blue. And you see the Milky Way rotating over here. And this comes around to one day and then it's going to stop. So I'm going to play this again because I know it's kind of hard to catch this the first time around. So we're going to watch stellarium for a minute first. Here's the Milky Way going past right here. That is the red shifted part. And as this comes around here, this is the blue shifted part. So the Milky Way passes over us twice in one day. And then here we come back there again. Now I'm going to look over at the plot again. Let me get this going. Now watch this going red shifted out to here. And it's going to go away, and then when it comes back, it's going to come over to the higher frequencies, blue shifted. And this is coming back where it started, which you're going to see the thing start going to the red again. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to play it just one more time. Hope you're not getting tired of this, but I think it's kind of cool to actually see this because, you know, what you can do with this, I mean, you can go in your backyard and you can actually pick up the Milky Way on a dish antenna that you can make for, you know, around 150 bucks and get this all working. It's kind of cool, I think. So there it is. That's a do-it-yourself radio astronomy project that you can do. And I don't know why it's doing that. Now, I would like to say that I figured this all out on my own, and you know, but that is not true at all. I was trying to find a project that I could do, that I could understand, and do it myself in a reasonably short period of time as a first radio astronomy project. And this is the link here in this presentation. This takes you to the instructions that I use for the people who figured this out originally and tell you basically step by step where to buy these things, where to get the software, how to do the whole thing. So I'm going to post this presentation on my webpage, www.hollandobservatory.net, and you can go to this link if you'd like to. And if you're interested in doing this project yourself, that's something you can do. So that was my first time out with it, but I plan on doing a lot more with this. I'm very interested in doing this. When you look at the hydrogen in the Milky Way, there's a couple things you can do. You can use this radio dish to map out the shape of the Milky Way galaxy, its size and shape, at the hydrogen wavelength, show where all the hydrogen is in the Milky Way, and make a map of the Milky Way galaxy. The other thing you can do is, since you've got the red shift and the blue shift, you can actually measure the rotation rate of the Milky Way. So you can go see how far out is red shifted, how much is blue shifted, and there's a very simple formula called the Doppler shift formula, a very simple formula to use, and you can actually calculate how fast the Milky Way is actually rotating. So being able to do that from your backyard, I think that's pretty cool, and I thought it was a fun DIY project, and There you go.
Hey, Doug,
Yes.
I got a question.
All right.
On the graph, you had frequency along the X. Is that RSSI on the?
Well,
On the
I don't know what
line?
RSSI is, but it's how many dB down. This is like, I'm looking at it now, 64 dB, minus 66 dB, minus 69 dB. Yeah, so that is,
Okay.
and as for what the reference point is in dB, I don't know. That's a really good question, but this is dB relative to something that I'm not sure what the reference point is. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I mean, this is definitely amplitude
Yep.
in dB of some sort. Now, I have to, like I said, you know, I just got this start, I just got this going this week, so I'm not an expert on this. But I was pretty excited to see that we can actually see the red shift and the blue shift of the Milky Way that's going by. Okay, any other questions? There it is one more time. Kind of fun, I think. All righty, so that's that. Next up, we have a Members Minute with Chris Wells, our Vice President. And Chris's Members Minute is called Home and Away Astrophotos. So take it away, Chris.
You're good to go, Chris.
Okay, good evening. Mine's a very short presentation this evening. So home and away astrophotos. One of the things that a number of club members is going to be doing next week is going to the El Dorado Star Party. And I get very excited going to dark skies. So I thought I'd do a quick compare of recent astrophotos I've taken at home here in Light Pollution Central, which is League City for me. That's Border 8 skies, and compare them with some of the astrophotos that I took in West Texas, which are magical skies, last year. So I'm going to do a quick compare and then show you some newly processed ones. Okay, so this one, obviously the Whirlpool Galaxy M51. This one I actually took from home, and I did this using a C11 Hyperstar setup and a cooled Astro camera, and 39 images, each being 3 minutes. So I had to go for approximately about an hour and a half or so of exposure time to get this. But I was delighted to be able to actually image this from home. But when you go to West Texas, it's a lot easier, and it's a lot better. So this, instead of doing an hour and a half, you can actually use a lot smaller telescope. And this one is just about an hour up with a smaller telescope, and you can see you just get so much more detail out of the West Texas kind of images. You can see a lot more nebulosity here. You can see a lot more blue in the outer spiral arms of M51 here. Whereas if you look at the previous one, everything is a bit dull. A lot of the blue tends to be eradicated with our skies here. So that's so obviously that's why I'm excited. That's why I'm excited to go to the El Dorado Star Party next week. Here's another one, M51. I took this one here at home as well in light pollution conditions. You see lots of noise in the image, but did get a good view nonetheless of the Andromeda Galaxy. And then when you compare it with West Texas, it's just that much easier to take better astrophotos when you go to West Texas. That's where it's happening at. And, Jay and Neil's main presentation this evening just showed you how good photography is when you go to West Texas. Absolutely amazing work that Jay and Neil did. And I'm just looking forward to getting out under those skies, because it's just so much easier to do. Okay. And these are some that I've also done at home. I've shown these in recent presentations. It's just a collage of what I did at home with a C11. Each of these images, once again, is at least an hour with the large diameter Schmidt-Cassegrain C11 and Hyperstar F2 imaging. So you can do this at home, encourage everybody to do it. But when you go to West Texas, it's a lot easier to make even better photos. So these are the selection that I've just done from TSP. My first TSP was last year in 2019. These are some of the images that I've taken. You know, you start to see the real outer bands here of the Black Eye Galaxy, things that you'd never be able to get in Lead City. Sombrero Galaxy here as well, Eagle Nebula, Pillars of Creation, or a lovely black nebulosity there, dark nebula. So little chart at the left there, these are TSP in 2019, and I'm doing ESP, or the Eldorado Star Party, in 2020. Back to you, Doug.
You're good, Doug?
All right, thank you. Chris, thank you for sharing your pictures with us. Those are just getting better and better all the time. And yeah, we are excited about going to Eldorado Star Party next week. It's going to be good. But thank you for continuing to bring us your images each month. Those are very interesting, great pieces of work. Next up, we have David with Star Party News. Tell us what we need to know about star parties, David.
You're good to go, David.
All right. Still in limbo, but we are actually beginning to make progress. Last month we had a good one, and we've got a couple coming up. All right, Saturday the 26th. Apparently, it was an International Observe the Moon at the LPI. Had no idea. They didn't call us. Right now, LPI has been doing a lot of stuff virtually. If they're like any of the other colleges and things along that line, they may not be having in-live meetings until first or second quarter of 2021. But moving on to the Star Party agenda, was it 2 weekends from now, our next weekend, October 15th through 17th, Fort McCavitt has been scratched. Lisa put that note out, I think, about 2 to 3 weeks ago. As Doug and Chris have mentioned, El Dorado Star Party is coming up next week, 12th through the 17th, with restrictions. I've still left this up here. I don't know if it's, you guys can interject or chime in if it's too late to register, but if somebody wants to consider going, information is here, eldoradostarparty.org. Here's roughly where it is. It looks like a little bit west of where the fort would be. Okay, George Observatory, last I heard that there were talks to try to open it up toward the end of October, but Tracy says, and I quote, "Don't hold your breath." Friday, October 23rd, we will be having an all clubs meeting. It will not, oops, I need to change that. It will not be at the HMNS. It will be, drum roll, on your own computers. It will be virtual. HAS has a 400-seat license for Zoom, and Joe Califf and Don Selle have agreed to help host it. We've got Robert Riggs from San Antonio, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit. Saturday the 24th, A-Day is canceled. Now, Doug and I literally, I think it was yesterday, we got a note from a lady at JSC in conjunction with Clear Creek ISD. Apparently for JSC employees, they're having, I guess, something close to 1,000 people at the Apollo Stadium, which is to the northeast of Challenger Park, where the club used to do outreach. Now, it's not quite on the other side of 45. It's still on the west side of 45, but there's apparently a large football stadium there. I had to double confirm. Yes. 0100 is when they would like somebody to come in and tell them what's up with the night sky. We still have to work on this. But it turns out this is Crew 1 launch of Dragon. And so they're show us what's in the night sky around 1 o'clock, and at 1:30 Central Time, it's slated to lift off from Kennedy. So that's why they've 1,000+ people in this stadium for this. So we still have some details to work out. I have no idea what they truly want from us, but we'll see if we can help them. If not, I don't know. 0100 is sort of a deal breaker for some. I don't know. All right, Friday, November 27th, we do have a Hack Winery event. It will probably likely proceed. All right, Friday, October 23rd at 7, we've got Robert Reeves, is accomplished author and photographer. He's going to be our virtual speaker all the way from San Antonio. To register, I'm going to put this in email, but apparently he did the bit.ly, and Joe put this together for me. It kept capitalizing all of this, and apparently the link doesn't work if it's capitalized. So we want to lowercase everything, obviously, except the 2. I'm going to put this in an email and send it out. But Robert Reeves is no slacker. He has authored 3 books through Willem Bell on webcam astrophotography, wide field astrophotography, and turns out I have this one on the shelf. When I first started picking up on him, I said, the name sounds awfully familiar, and I looked over next to Chris Kraft's book on mission control, and this one was sitting on my shelf. He is an accomplished author, both astro and lunar photographer, and I thought Chris would salivate over this one. This is his C14 Hyperstar that he's got going. He just wheels it in and out of the garage, and he is actually attempting to do, he's been doing deep sky work with the C14 from his driveway in San Antonio. But Bob is known for his Facebook page, 365 Days of the Moon, is a very accomplished lunar photographer. Okay, as I said, social distancing is being observed. There is hope for outreach events, and hopefully this will continue as the number of cases go down, and the possibility and the likelihood of a vaccine becoming available. All right, that's pretty much it. And so we have our 2 friends here. He made a rounding error. It's actually 2020 when everything is supposed to go to heck, not 2012. But he's not going to rework the calendar. So back to you, Doug.
Go ahead, Doug.
All right, David, thank you for the Star Party news, and thank you for continuing to be our Star Party chairman. Okay, our next meeting will be on November 13th. It will be another virtual meeting. The speaker will be to be determined. We will announce later who our main speaker will be. But thank you for attending our October meeting, and we hope that you can join us again in November.